Very good morning, and you're welcome to today's Signpost webinar. I hope you're keeping safe and well wherever you're joining us from today. My name is Mark Gibson, and I'm the manager of the Teagasc Connected Programme. I'm also joined by Pat Murphy, who is the head of the Teagasc Knowledge Transfer Environment Programme. Good morning, Pat.
Good morning. How are you this morning?
I'm very good, very good. Just to remind everyone that this series is brought to you by Teagasc in collaboration with Dairy Sustainability Ireland, the National Rural Network, and Food Drink Ireland SkillNet. And today we'll be hearing a farmer's perspective on environmental sustainability, particularly on biodiversity, emissions, and water quality. And I'm delighted to be joined by Thomas Duffy, who is a dairy farmer and former president of Macra and Feirme. Thomas, good morning to you.
Good morning, Mark. Thanks very much for having me.
You're joining us from Cavan this morning. What's the weather like up there today?
A little bit overcast, but probably no harm after the last few warm days we've had. Yeah, no, it's very nice here. And I have to say it's been a nice change the last 2 weeks.
Yes, indeed. And I think we're promised a good weekend as well. So it's certainly welcome over in the west here. Get a bit more of the silage in. So Thomas, could you tell us a little bit about maybe about the work you're doing and your previous life? You were obviously a very outspoken president of Macra and Feirme, and you have some environmental credentials as well to back up what you're saying.
Yeah, I suppose I was delighted to hand over to my successor, John Keane. I know he's doing a wonderful job there as Macra president, so I would have served in the role for 2 years. I had to take a little bit of a step away from the farm. I'm kind of coming back now and trying to play catch up after 2 years. But it was very ably managed by my, because we're in partnership here between my parents, Ned and Kathleen. And then in terms of, I suppose, my environmental credentials, so I would have gone through Dundalk IT. I have a bachelor's in sustainable agriculture from Dundalk, and then I kind of still had the appetite to learn more about the environmental side of things, particularly. So I went and I did a master's in UCD in environmental resource management, which was really, really valuable because it covered a very wide area from that exactly climate change, conservation management, and nutrients and water quality. And my specific dissertation, kind of mini dissertation that I would have done for that master's, was on cattle breeding for adaptations to climate change before it kind of became a central issue. And so it was very interesting to see the areas where there's huge benefits for farmers in addressing climate challenges and reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and how we can work together to do that.
It sounds like there's a paper or a session in that in itself. We might have you back again. Thomas, there's a lot of negative, I suppose, discussion around farming in the media at the moment, and some would say it's unfair. From your own perspective, what do you make of the narrative that's circulating at the moment? Yeah,
it can be very challenging, and I saw it myself during my 10 years or my tenure. Like the loudest, most ardent voices will always get the most attention, particularly from it's much harder to get attention for a message of people working together, even though we see the likes of the Burn Life Project as an example, or the ASIP program. People aren't as interested in talking about things when they're working well. And I think there is still a very huge group of people, both agricultural and environmental, who are working together on a day-to-day basis. But the reality is they don't have the time to talk as much because they're too busy doing the work and trying to actually progress the industry. And I think it can be challenging. Look, there are genuine, and I'll touch on it a little bit in a second, but there are genuine challenges to us in the agricultural sector. We have trends that we can't ignore, that we need to address. And while we might be doing the right thing, the question is how to scale these things up. And like in other industries, I think it'd be much simpler, because you're talking about a small, take energy, for instance. You have a small number of energy producers. Switching to renewable energies is relatively, it's not easy, but it's relatively easy in terms of getting buy-in. But when you have 144,000 plus individual farms, to try and get change on a big scale is a very difficult challenge. And that's where knowledge transfer and the likes of this program are so vitally important.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, look, I'm conscious we're eating into your presentation time here, so maybe we'll get straight to the presentation. Yeah. And a reminder to everybody that you can submit questions for Thomas using the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. We encourage as many questions as possible. We can't guarantee we'll get through all of them. And today's session is being recorded and it will be available afterwards on the Teagasc website, the presentation and the recording. So are you okay to share there, Thomas?
Yeah.
And just to bring to your attention as well that today's session is being recorded as a podcast and is available on the podcast platform of your choice. Okay, Thomas, we'll hand over to you and we'll talk to you afterwards.
Thanks very much, Mark. Okay, so I suppose briefly, we're going to be taking a look kind of from my own farming experience and some of the other things that I would have seen on many other farms and kind of discussions I've had with farmers over the last 2 years and indeed before that. So the question on biodiversity, emissions and water quality, and I won't be holding anything back. I will be showing you on the farm what has worked or what I feel has worked and what I've seen hasn't worked, not necessarily because that's not going to encourage me to abandon a project, but it means that there's a different challenge. So I suppose very briefly, and I'm not going to dwell on it too much, we've done the introductions. I'm farming in East Cavan here in a farm partnership with my father Ned and my mother Kathleen. The farm is about 51 hectares in total, owned, but it's fragmented. We're extremely fragmented farm, split by the N3 here, with the longer out blocks being 10 minutes away. And the grazing platform is the largest block, with about 50 acres owned, and then about 6 hectares, about 15 acres rented in to try and graze 105 cows. And for anyone who's doing the figures, that's quite a high stocking density. There was a time where our stocking density was even higher than this. And some people talk about stocking densities. At one stage, we would have been milking 120 cows on 20 hectares. So we would have had a stocking density greater than 5 with no potential for bringing in our silage ground because our silage ground was aside. That was overstocked. There's no two ways about it. It wasn't a profitable way to do the business. It was a short-term measure as we tried to regain some more grazing land. At the moment, it is still very challenging. It's quite a high stocking density. And really, that kind of showed me both the vulnerability during that time period when we would get more than 3 weeks without drought. We'd be in serious trouble here because we were going around so fast. But equally, I think some of the things that I'll talk about later on really show the benefit. We've been very intensively invested in clover for a long time. And during those drought periods, the clover was what saved us really in the high stocking density because it would regrow so quickly in warm weather. So as I say, the cows are predominantly Holstein Friesian registered with an increasing percentage of crossbreds, and these would be Norwegian, Jersey, and even some older Montbéliard-based crossbreds bred to high EBI Friesians, and we select on that. I'll get into that in a second. So our philosophy is very simple. I heard this great, wonderful phrase one day: willful waste brings woeful want. And that really is what we kind of try to live by. The first key is, instead of trying to produce more milk, are we wasting milk because somatic cell counts or animals are unhealthy? Right. Well, we focus on the health and we eliminate. I don't want 10 more buckets of milk if it's gonna lead to 1 more bucket of waste. That just so we try to focus on that. And I suppose as a result of that, our view on the likes of pollution is it's an expensive business to be in. And we often talk about economic viability. Well, every kg that you're losing to the water, or every kg of methane that's produced, right? That's essentially a kg of nitrogen that you've purchased it somewhere, or it's a kg of feed that the animal has converted inefficiently into methane. And that's my outlook on it. Climate change and those other elements are also very, very important. But I'm not going to waste something if I can. So as I say, I'm not going to dwell on the farm here, but it just gives a quick overview of kind of where we are. We're solidly, I would say, middle ground kind of average farm in terms of production. We do some things very well. We don't do things, and we need to improve them in other places. The calving interval certainly is an area that we are improving all the time, and we've come down substantially from about 295 or so in recent years while using sex semen. Our 6-week calving rate, we're quite kind of happy with about 76%. I'm not looking to go much higher than that, maybe 80% or thereabouts. As you can see, kind of first lactation performances there, we're fairly happy with those. And we're growing in and around 13 tons. So some of those fields that you can see are quite low would have been reseeded. Actually, one of them was reseeded in the multispecies, and we'll get to that now. But in and around, we're probably aiming to produce around 13 tons of grass. and then supplementing mostly with high quality forages and meal to fill the gap, we would be feeding less than, our aim really is less than a ton of meal, and trying to utilize as much grass as possible. So those are just kind of some of the overviews. So I suppose the three elements that we've talked about, or we will be talking about. First, the emissions. And I think if there's any message I can get anyone to come away with here is that there's a lot of confusion out there at the moment about greenhouse gas emissions versus ammonia emissions. And low emission slurry spreading and protected urea have a benefit in terms of their greenhouse gas emissions, but really they're ammonia. And the way I would always summarize it is climate change gases, greenhouse gases, are global gases. Ammonia is a local gas. And when farmers say to me about, the cost of investing in either using protected urea or using using low emission slurry spreading, what my response very often with that is, well, actually ammonia at a low level, and you can smell it yourself when you're walking through a very heavily slurried field. It actually is damaging the cells of the plant around it. And that's why I think low emission slurry spreading is such an easy move for 90% of farmers in reality. And then water quality. So I suppose there we have the question of, surface water and groundwater, and surface water is probably more important from a biological point of view, and it's more important from a recreational point of view, particularly in the likes of Cavan here. We've got a very good fishing tourism, whereas groundwater is really the water that we drink. So that's why we want to protect it. And we have got, Ireland has historically been very good in terms of nitrates levels. When the nitrates derogation was brought in, it was really for more industrialized countries, because they were suffering, unfortunately, with a thing called blue baby syndrome, which was high nitrates levels, and their children was killing them. And then high phosphorus levels, depending on the soil that you're on, that's probably more of a priority. We know the results from ASSA. I'm not going to dwell on that. So in terms of biodiversity, then, obviously biodiversity has its own value. We all appreciate it. But I suppose, why does it matter for an individual farmer? I have heard before, and I will probably hear again, what good is that? What good is that thing? What we have to understand is that when an ecosystem unbalances, it will have knock-on effects because we're part of the ecosystem. And a really simple example of this was, the wiping out of birds of prey, and the loss of some of the habitat for the likes of buzzards in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And the massive explosion that we've had in hooded crows. And I wouldn't imagine any farmer on this today is a huge fan of hooded crows, because we all know they're quite nasty creatures to have around the place. But I suppose a local example of that, buzzards started breeding on my farm 4 years ago. They've successfully fledged 3 times. The crow population has absolutely plummeted. We used to be, they're constantly eating meal on us and devouring crops. But now we really do see, because they've been predating on the chicks. So I suppose what it really matters, and I suppose this was a shot from my single farm payment this year, and I just wanted to highlight it as an issue, because this image was very clearly taken during the drought last year. So you can see how burnt up my part of East Cavan got. Now look, we're lucky to have dry soil up here, and it's mostly a gravel base, so it dries out fast. But you can just see the impact that that's going to have. And increasing climate change means 2 things. It means flooding, and it means more drought. And unfortunately, we're going to have to be the ones suffering from this. When I talk about climate change, it won't be people sitting in an office in Dublin. No offense to anyone who sits in an office, but it will be the farmers on the ground who will suffer the worst effects of climate change. And while we will suffer, obviously, so many of the countries that are already more vulnerable will suffer greater, but nonetheless, we will not escape it. Our fields will be flooded. Our lands will be flooded in winter, and we will enter into drought. Not every year, that's not how climate change works, but it will be an effect. So quick introduction to the terminology I'm going to be using, just because sometimes it can be useful. We've already talked about ammonia gas here. Methane, this is belched by cows. One of my favorite things I always say, if you're reading an article and it says, anything about cow farts, stop reading it. That person has no idea what they're talking about. It's a waste of time. So it's released, it's breathed out. Nitrous oxide emissions is incredibly powerful greenhouse gas, which is released by the likes of slurry and fertilizer, about 276 times the carbon dioxide emissions. Carbon dioxide itself, mostly from fossil fuels, is mostly pre-farm gate. I know we've all seen the pictures of our tractors belching black smoke, but in reality, most of that is actually most of the carbon dioxide in the food cycle is transportation and production of fertilizers, etc. But there is a very big question around drain peat, for instance, and the release of carbon dioxide. So can carbon sequestration save us? It's going to be a very vital, important element of what we do, because we aren't measuring it 100% at the moment, particularly soil sequestration, but it won't be enough to offset what we are doing. We are going to need to take a double-sided approach, and that's what we've done here. We've tried to increase carbon sequestration, but in order to balance the book, you need to reduce your emissions one way or another. And it's a very complicated global political matter trying to measure these things and the accuracy. And again, Teagasc are doing a lot of research I know on this, and we're very hopeful, but that will take time, ultimately, time that we just don't have. And in terms of hedgerows, we need a net increase in hedgerows, and like new or bigger hedgerows. And we're talking about changing the management. The existing hedgerows, if they were there in 1990, simply won't cut it from an emissions inventory point of view. So Mark tipped on a little bit on the I suppose battle that there's currently going on, and I wanted to kind of look at this from a farmer's point of view for a second and say, okay, well, I don't want this to be an us versus them. So what I say, I think it's more the farming community and our advisors and the entire industry around us, and they means, I suppose, more environmentalists, but also the wider public. What are they looking at? So what we say, and these are all factually accurate and true statements, we say that Ireland has the lowest emissions per litre of milk in the EU and the fourth lowest in beef. And the best assessment that we have at the moment says that very clearly. That is true. However, what they say, and they are also right, is that Ireland has the highest percentage of national emissions in the EU related to agriculture, 35 and growing. We say that Ireland has the second highest water quality in the EU after Austria, I believe, which is true. But farming, as they rightfully point out, farming is still the largest pressure on water quality, with declines in most categories. And the reality of this, I suppose, is that we are the largest land use, so it kind of makes sense. But it's still something that we have to deal with. Ireland has above the EU average area of habitat on farms at about 13%. And obviously it varies between the west and the east of the country very often. But you compare that to the likes of only 2.1% in the Netherlands. And again, that is true. But it's also true that farmland birds, particularly iconic ones like carlew and corncrake, but also the likes of yellowhammer and meadow pipit, are declining, and some species by as much as 50% over the last couple of years, partially due to habitat loss and trying to protect those. So again, those sides of that discussion are both accurate in what they're saying. There is a lot of misinformation going around, but those are both accurate in what we're saying. So the question is, how do we move from what we have in our column to affecting what is in the other column? And again, there's this dichotomy and this kind of argument all the time that you have so-called intensive farmers on one side, and on the other side, you have high nature value farming. Well, here's two lovely pictures. I mean, you've got your green grass on the left-hand side, and my dairy cows coming in, and you have your fertilized grass there. Okay, you've got hedgerows and that, and it's growing, it's great. And on the other side, you have this wonderful species-rich meadow land. Well, there isn't a dichotomy, and it's kind of nonsense, because they're both my farm. They're different parts of my farm, but they're both my farm. And the reality is, the one with the cows is the one that's paying for the one with the species-rich grassland. Because if I want to be a full-time farmer, if I want to make money, I need to pay for that. I can't just sit on land. But not all the changes that we make are going to be equal. And broadly on our farm, when we were implementing these things, we looked at kind of three different things and how quickly we could implement them, changes in practice, whatever cost. So on the easy win side, and as you see, I'll kind of relate these back to, so AM means ammonia, CC means climate change measure, biodiversity is represented by bio, and WQ is water quality. So protected urea is a straight swap. It's very simple. We did it 3 or 4 years ago. I think at this stage we started using it, and we've been fully protected urea for 3 years. Apart from trying to source it sometimes, it's very straight. Low emission slurry spreading, it either requires you to purchase one, or if you're using a contractor. My contractor purchased it, so it was a very straight swap for us. We pay a little bit more, but we get far better return from the grass because it's not covered in slurry. Liming is the easiest, cheapest fertilizer that you can use, but we're still uncommon. Improving the beef value of dairy bred stock. again, this is selecting a decent high dBi, either AI straw or a high terminal bull when you're breeding. Improving hedgerow management, again, simply cutting them in the A shape, and Catherine Keena and others have done great work on this. But again, it's the problem of a lot of contractors are not aware of it. My contractor, no problem, again, same guy, switched, I want you to cut it in an A shape, right? What does that mean? Okay, yeah, grand, we can do whatever you want. You're paying the bill ultimately. And if farmers made that simple change, you'd actually have a huge benefit for both biodiversity and for climate change. But the other simpler one is just cutting less often. Most hedges don't need to be cut every year. We cut on a 3-year cycle, and they don't escape out in the ditches. We're not losing land. It's just a matter of management. Milk recording or cattle weighing is the obvious. Again, it's from a performance point of view, but also from climate change and ammonia point of view, culling that lower percentage of the herd. I once heard that you could cut 5% of most dairy herds and it wouldn't affect the bull tag whatsoever. And that is true. Because you've got animals taking feed that are just not performing. But if you don't know it, you can't manage it. And increasing longevity and reducing involuntary culling. So again, that ties back to that breeding healthier cows in the first place. Now, the smaller changes in the investments that you need to make are the likes of sex semen. And you need good heat management with that. We've got a vasectomized bull with a chin ball on him and tail paint to run it. Clover incorporation, I know that there is rightfully a very big push on this. But the reality is in colder soils, it can be more difficult. Upgrading fertilizer spreaders, for instance, and we'll tip on that in a second. Tolerance of weeds is probably the most psychologically the hardest idea. Having areas of the farm that are wild and resisting the urge to spray or to top them can be very difficult. Trying to incorporate them into fields as well, it can be a very big challenge. Red clover silage, we are managing that at the moment. We have one field where no nitrogen has gone into it for 2 years now, and it's still able to give us 4 cuts of silage and really high quality stuff. Minimum tillage, again, that's really, minimum tillage, I think probably the fastest adoption has been up here in Cavan because we hate picking stones. So the bigger, costlier investments and the likes of renewable energy, and ultimately they have to pay in order for us to do them. Solar panels, ponds are re-wetting, you're going to be losing land. Covering all slurry tanks are going to be essential for ammonia emissions, and recontouring farm roadways. So on fertilizer, it's probably the single biggest change that most of us can make. I think there needs to be a bit of a change in our attitude towards fertilizer, because fertilizer doesn't grow grass. If you don't have growing conditions, it's not going to grow grass. No matter how much nitrogen you spread, you need sun, water, soil, and ultimately heat. And in those conditions, then fertilizer helps to grow grass faster. And that's ultimately key to this. But it's the largest source of non-methane emissions for agriculture. It's the largest source of water pollution. And we've done a great job here on kind of point source pollution. So leaks, for instance, from the slurry tanks, etc. And roadway runoffs is really, there's been massive improvements there. But the diffuse one is the diffuse one is a bit more complicated. So too much slurry too early in ground conditions, and we all know the challenges of calendar farming, and there may be better conditions at the back end, but tanks have to be emptied. But maybe going a little bit lighter and having that kind of risk factor. Okay, I'm only going to half empty my tanks, but I'm only going to apply it at 1,500 gallons. It's not always an option, but when it is excellent. Early nitrogen, I think, ultimately it does depend where in the country you are and your timing for nitrogen, but ultimately you need soil temperatures and you need it to be dry. The same rules apply in spring as in autumn. And in heavy wet soils, we see that mostly nitrogen is lost to the air and nitrous oxide emissions. So that's a climate change issue. In dry sandy soils, is mostly lost to the water. I think low use of nutrient management plants can actually be a very big challenge, because a lot of farmers have paid for them now, but they're not using them on a day-to-day basis. In my personal opinion, so these are both my personal opinion, and feel free to disagree in the Q&As. I don't use compounds on our farm. I found them unusable when I was doing the nutrient management plan. It was far more straightforward for me to just use P and K. Why? Because I'd have fields with K index 4 and P index 2. I'd have fields with P index 4 and K index 2. So it was just 18612 to me, I don't think is a very useful compound at all. And again, I know that's a controversial statement, but we follow the sustainable use program on the nutrient management plan. And then in terms of ignoring calendars, again, I don't get upset if I don't have X amount of nitrogen spread by a certain date. My question is, have I grown enough grass this spring, and the weather conditions been good enough to get the return on that? Like if a calf is not eating, and ultimately grass is not that different. If it's not growing, putting nitrogen onto it is not going to help. All it's going to do is lead to pollution events, and that's the little comedic bit. So I suppose when the conditions are right, what do you need? Well, where possible, no fertilizer, but this is rarely the case. Let's be honest about it. Clover can perform on its own without it, but it depends on your stocking density. It depends on a whole number of things, particularly at the spring. It can be very hard. This time of year, we might skip a whole fertilizer round, and I know a lot of dairy farms have started doing that. And then again, that all depends on the soil condition being right. So your P and K, your lime for your pH, and then your nitrogen after that. So what we spread is very simple: slurry, straights, and protected urea. Nothing more complicated than that, and we follow the nutrient management planner. So in terms of water quality, in terms of the investments that we've made, so you can see this is a new roadway was put in. It was sloped towards the field. On the other side of the hedge there for runoff as well, we had to break a few things to keep it from flowing down. So we've contoured it. We have speed bumps and all the rest of that sort of activity on it, because again, everywhere in Cavan is either on a hill or at the bottom of a hill, and at the bottom of the hill there's an awful lot of streams and rivers and lakes. So that's really what we focused on. We upgraded the fertilizer spreader after the old one, I think, was 30 years old itself one day, and instead of buying a brand new one, what we did was we went for a second-hand one with a higher spec, so weighted, for instance, and hydraulic control on both sides, and that allowed me a much more accurate spread when I'm going around the field. So if I get near a wet spot, I'll cut it down, or I'll shut it off altogether and spread on the other side. This is our red clover. It's just taken there recently. It's beginning to regrow. You can see it. It's also got a little bit of white clover in it. Our nutrient management plan, and again, this is the challenge to using the nutrient management plan, because the nutrient management plan is spot on. Yeah, I've got a rate of say 54% here for urea. But what does that mean? Like, if I'm talking to my dad, or I'm talking to a student, I'm telling him to go out and spread, I can't tell him to go 54. I can set that on the spreader, but how many kilos of nitrogen, what bag is it going to be? So what we did was we just put it into an Excel file and created it so that it multiplied out. And there may be other systems for doing it. It's just the one that we've been using for the last while. And as you can see, the crossouts are all, I suppose, where we spread. So you can see we skipped quite a lot in spring already, because the weather conditions simply weren't there for us in January to March. And so we went a bit heavier in later on in the year. So the warts, I suppose this is where, and look, we haven't had an issue with protected urea. And the evidence is that there isn't an issue with protected urea. The research is all there. I'd be very confident in using it. I think some of the challenge around moving to protected urea is for farms that weren't using urea beforehand and not giving it enough time and switching from CAN. The lower 6-week calving risk is always a risk with more sex even, because you're more likely to get repeats. You get about 46% conception rate. We got a little bit higher on some bulls, maybe 70% on some bulls, and then other bulls 20% last year, which is very poor. This year, looking at the fertility at the moment, we have a lot more held. We haven't gone to the 42 days yet, but it takes a bit of an iron constitution to introduce your beef bull before you're even finished your first round of AI, because the beef bull is going to pay for the extra sex semen, and allowing an animal to repeat that might be a good animal. I mean, this morning, one of my favorite animals is after repeating, and it's just going to beef because that's what has to happen now. But that being said, I had 2 Frisian bulls or Jersey Cross bulls born this year out of 27 calvings. The other 25 are all heifers. So, I mean, that return, I'll take that return very happily. And then we had another 10 limousines, which we were selling at over 300 euros a piece. And we were able to sell Angus's before most people were selling Angus's, so make benefit of an early market. Ultimately, there's no returns to the market where these are not cost neutral. Most of the things I've talked about have been cost neutral. The failures and the unknowns is always risky for farmers. Multi-species, there's huge potential, but weed control is quite simply a nightmare if the sward is not already clean. And I'll be telling you about how it kind of failed for us. And then increasing droughts and flooding as a result of climate change are actually going to make a lot of these measures harder. So it's our multi-species. As you can see, it's failed. And it's failed in the worst possible way, because you can see the chicory and plantain has established really well, but so have all those spear thistles. And this is a very dirty field. And we're trying to figure out how, because ultimately there are no products available at the moment that are chicory and plantain and clover safe all at once. We didn't even have a clover safe spray until recently, back again. So the issue really for us is, you know, how do we manage this? Now, look, this was unfortunate because we put it in at the start of a 6-week drought, and essentially nothing moved for the greatest period of time, which is a massive issue for us. Do I consider it a total failure? No, because it didn't work in what we wanted to do. But again, it's going to be challenging if we spread the uptake of these, because obviously that's gone beyond spot spraying. So in terms of biodiversity, I think this is the biggest kind of challenge, is probably a little bit more in the psyche than it is anything else. Space for nature. So this on the hedgerow side, right? That's a cut hedgerow. So that hedgerow is not going to be cut again for another 3 years, but you can very clearly see the shape. And it's a really good angle of the triangular shape, maximizing the amount of height and thickening the base. That hedge will deliver for biodiversity over the next couple of years. It'll deliver at the moment for shelter. It won't flower or fruit this year, and it often kills me to see hedgerows cut on an annual basis, because ultimately they're delivering nothing for biodiversity at all. So this is something that we could do, and actually literally saves us money here. But cutting it in the A shape is essential as well for the biodiversity. Ragwort, absolute hateful plant. I hate it around the place. But at the same time, those are cinnabar moth caterpillars. And so the resistance is always to try and prevent, because more of those ultimately will eat down. And I've seen them devour an entire ragwort spray, but unfortunately their numbers have declined over the years. And a wee patch of nettles, and as people can see in that, that's actually full of caterpillar silk. So this was this tiny patch, just a little patch in one of my grazing fields. And when I went around it, I copped it from while I was topping, and I went, do you know what? I'm going to leave it there. But I have no doubt that people thought I was absolutely crazy, because it was sitting in the middle of a field, this tiny patch of nettles. Why would he not tidy it up when the rest of the field was clean? But I mean, you can literally see there are thousands there. So very small, literally nothing. I'd have to do nothing in order to protect that. So then in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and how we can try to meet those. And again, I said I kind of specialized on this. So methane is the largest and most significant greenhouse gas that we in our agricultural system have to deal with. And ironically, it's actually the opposite when we're talking about beef or dairy. So in dairy cows, I mean, longer life means lower lifetime emissions, because that animal for 2 years is producing while it's growing. So the less heifers that you ultimately have coming in, and the faster those animals calve, if you like, the overheads, to use a financial term, carryover of methane are diluted over the animal's lifespan. So we know that, say, increasing, and the target for a lot of farms is 5.5 lactations. I mean, that's ultimately key to profitability. It's reducing because the animal is not paying itself back in its first lactation. It occasionally will pay itself back in the second lactation. It's a very high performing animal. But in reality, you're talking about third lactation before it's really, and ultimately pre-lactation doesn't often come until after fourth lactation. So again, how do we do this though? We need to improve EBI. We need to get good genetics into the herd. So we need to be selecting, and that means more voluntary culling and less involuntary culling. So less animals lame, less animals with mastitis, less animals with infertility problems. And then selecting out those animals to breed more efficiently. And this is where sex semen comes in, because I won't breed my whole herd. I'll only breed the top percentage of my herd, because I know even with the 46% conception rate that I will be. So I'll use my beef earlier on. Lower replacement rates, again, once you're not expanding, if your herd is stable. More mature cows in the third and fifth lactation, and calving, of course, between 20 and 26 months. For dairy, though, it's the opposite way around. In reality, I'm talking here about dairy beef because I don't want to comment on suckling. It's not my industry. But I mean, the key elements here are age at slaughter, getting that lower while maximizing the carcass weight. No point killing a 22-month steer that, you know, is killing into 180 kilos carcass weight, because that isn't great for the climate either. But the key is how to get up on that and then balance that and get them finished off grass as much as physically possible. And it is very doable. It's an ultimate pity to me that the way that we deal with bull beef in this country, because I think bull beef, certainly as a manufacturing product, maybe not so much for steak, is easily the lowest carbon emissions, easily per kg of beef. And the sire is ultimately more vital than the dam, in my opinion. So again, moving away from producing these sort of dairy bred stock and trying to reduce the number of heifers, and that's where sex semen comes in again. But ultimately as well, selecting these bulls. So what you see on one side is the lactation summary for one of my cows. You can see she's currently in 11th lactation and still performing very well, has been bulled, and I think she's on 21 days now at this stage. You can see her kind of, again, protein percentages. But what's a really interesting one is here in her 7th lactation, she delivered her peak at 707. And that was only in 293. And again, these are milk reported data. This was a crossbred cow, actually a Montbéliard Frisian cow. But you can see the performance, and even in the 5th lactation there, you got 605 kgs of milk solids delivered. So a lot of farmers I talk about, they talk about culling out on age. I personally don't. If an animal is healthy and an animal is able to go back and calf, why not keep her? And she will deliver for you. Again, the bull below is an Angus. It's my own stock bull. I had to spend a little bit of money buying him, but I won't say how much. But high terminal index, 86 of an EBI, which within his own breed is 5-star. It's still only 3-star crossbreed, of course. But I'm looking for a short gestation, easy calving bull. His calves are delivering. The interesting thing is, because I sell all ex-farm, I'm getting repeat customers coming back to me and going, do you have any more of that? And they know that the Anguses I sell them are, number one, actually Anguses. And number two, I'll tell them if there's Jersey blood in them. I'll tell them if there's whatever blood in them. But they've generally reported to me that ultimately it's the bull that matters far more for when they're killing out. So just a sec. So that was, I suppose, a whistle-stop tour. I kind of want to give a lot of time for questions, because I know there might be challenges to some of what I've said here, and I welcome those too. As Mark said, I think at the beginning, I was very outspoken during my tenure. And if people want to contact me by email or by Twitter, they're perfectly free to do so. I suppose the element that unfortunately I don't have very nice pictures on, as I said, is the biodiversity on the farm. This is one of our lone bush and stuff. I've kind of touched on it a little bit. One of the good indicators for our farm is the fact that buzzard is continuing to breed on our farm, because it indicates that there's sufficient feed, and that means that the entire ecosystem underneath it is. And thankfully, we don't have any poultry farms too close that he might cause issues for. So look, I think that is it. And I think ultimately as well, I had a very interesting, and I just finished on this anecdote, I had a very interesting presentation one day to my father, who was involved with the men's shed. And most of the men in that were in their late 60s, 70s, 80s. And we had a discussion about biodiversity, and they were talking about how they listened to the curlew growing up. And I had to stop them for a second and say, I have never heard a curlew or a corncrake except in recording, because that has been lost by the time that I started my farming career. And this is something we talk about, shifting baseline, that we mightn't always. And the past was not a perfect thing. I often tell people that. I mean, killcrow and all those aren't being used by my generation. But ultimately, it is a challenge for us to see the changes that are happening, because they often happen at a very slow scale. Unfortunately, a lot of them are speeding up, and climate change is one of those things. But I suppose the only, if I can finalize on a message, I would say that in everything, reducing our impact to the environment is saving us money, and that's ultimately what's the key for farmers, and that's the key message that I focus on in my presentations. But thank you very much. Thanks, Mark, again for giving me the opportunity to speak, and we'll leave it open to questions of that.
Thank you, Thomas. Thought-provoking as always. So for all of those people who wondered who the face behind Tay Saves Lives, finally get to meet him. So, and you're obviously very active on Twitter. So you're very aware of the I suppose the differing views that are out there around agriculture. And I suppose my question to you is, how confident are you that we will meet the various environmental targets that are set out? Particularly, I know you spoke about ammonia a lot during your presentation. Yeah, that's a general question, I know, yeah. But what's your view on that?
Right. So my view is before we start kind of talking about how much we can get farmers to do, we have to eliminate all the barriers. So again, ammonia is a great example, because at the moment we know there's obviously delays with manufacturing. So many farmers are buying low emission slurry spreading that the actual manufacturers can barely keep up. And a really interesting anecdote, so I started using low emission slurry spreading here, and most of my neighbours are actually, we're a slightly strange area of the world, because most of my neighbours are full-time beef farmers. They're not part-time, they're full-time beef farmers. And they would have been a bit skeptical of all of this. And then all of a sudden, I remember I drove over one day, and every neighbour had adopted low emission slurry spreading because they had seen it work on our farm. You can only do what you see. But for the likes of protected urea, for instance, it was a massive challenge for us the last 3 years to actually get access to this. And I know during my time in Macra, we did a survey, and 50% of farmers were not able to get protected urea. If it's not there, we can't buy it. And ultimately, this is where the industry has to deliver for us. If it's there, farmers will take up these measures. We look at sex semen. I mean, we've been bashing the sex semen because we've been behind the UK on it for years. This year, we've seen a massive increase in sex semen, which will have a lot of knock-on benefits, but not actually maybe for the guy who's using the sex semen, maybe for the next guy who's finishing the animals. And less of those having to be exported. So am I confident that farmers could? Yeah, I am very confident that farmers could. I think you will always have the early adopters, then the mass adopters. I think with most of these technologies, we're now at mass adoption point. You will have holdouts, you will have resistance, you will have people going back or whatever. But again, the likes of, say, Clover is a simple example. The fact that there was such little joint up thinking that we lost Clover Max and we lost 2,4-DB, and there was no outcry. I think this was very disappointing, actually, from an environmentalist point of view. There was no outcry about the farmers losing this. Now, thankfully, obviously, Teagasc and the Department of Agriculture have worked to get us access to that again. But the fact that there was that detachment while we were simultaneously meant to be reducing our nitrogen fertilizer that we couldn't seed clover in was crazy.
We had two speakers last week from Birdwatch Ireland, Anita Donaghy and Una Duggan, who were speaking about the decline in bird numbers. And I think, look, they were quite critical of we'd call it the system. I don't think they were leveling it at individual farmers by any means, but I felt that the system of farming in this country was leading us down a path of declining bird numbers and biodiversity. How can we reverse that? Are there enough signals coming from the marketplace, from policy, to support farmers in achieving this? I think 10% of farms to be covered to be allocated to biodiversity, I think is one of the targets. They would claim that that's probably a little under ambitious. What's your thoughts on that?
So first on returns to the market, there's no benefit. I mean, the consumer is great about saying they want these things, but they're not paying for it. And that's the long and the short of it. The likes of the Board BA Origin Green Programme is probably the closest that we get to it. And it's been criticised by a lot of people, I think, unfairly. What I will say in terms of, again, what the focus should be on is every farm has an area of unproductiveness, and that's patches and stuff like that. The question isn't, for me, so much about the area of habitat. The question is about the quality of habitat. You can do a lot with 5%, that if you have 10%, 20%, 30% of your farm semi-abandoned, it's going to yield nothing. I've got areas of my farm that are not managed as a habitat, and they're not yielding really, but they are less intensively farmed. So this is a challenge for us. In terms of reversing it, there are some things that simple things that we can do, and then there are more complicated, more challenging things. The biggest thing would probably be money for direct interventions for the likes of our really critically. And I know farmers, very highly stocked dairy farms, that are currently protecting curlew and corncrake on their farms, or curlew anyway, and others that are managing. As I said, I showed the high nature value farming that we have on our farm as well. We haven't got any of these rare, I think the rarest we have is the snipe that seems to, for some reason, love grazing on our intensive grassland, and not, it kind of abandons in nearly overgrown areas. And what would concern me as well is the rise of concepts like rewilding, which is essentially just land abandonment, because that's going to be a pinch point between these species. These species need farm management and paying for that. But there is a huge potential here, the farmers. But again, I think that the rule I always follow is do learn, do better. So yes, we used a lot of nitrogen to grow grass in the past. Now we're going to use clover to grow more grow more grass and use less nitrogen. Protect it, like red clover, another example. There are a lot of things that we're doing better today, but it is a slow uptake, and this is ultimately the problem, because a lot of these species need this to be accelerated to protect them.
I've one final question. I'm going to be selfish here before we get to the audience questions. You talked about nutrient management planning and the relatively low engagement by farmers with their nutrient. A lot of farmers would have nutrient management plans, but maybe that level of engagement isn't as what we'd like it to be. What would be the 3 or 4 things you'd like to see happen or that you think could help that situation?
Yeah, so as I say, I have a controversial position on compounds. I don't like compounds because I think they're too complicated. I think it's much simpler for a farmer at once or twice a year to go around his entire farm with P and then go around it with K at the appropriate time. And then for silage ground, obviously spread it, silage ground. And look, that means more driving and it means a bit more fossil fuels, but ultimately I think it's much more effective than trying to balance 18-6-12 or 10-10-20 or whatever with the nitrogen demands. The biggest thing I think is literally just to use it, and that's why we did it. We stuck it into the Excel file. I understand that there's the pasture-based program are doing stuff with this as well, but ultimately that it's not something that's shoved down the back of a folder. Like in a previous life, I would have done a few nutrient management plans for farmers, and their response then was, "Well, I'm still going to do the same thing I did before." And I'm like, "Well, there's money to be saved here, particularly like in areas like Cavan. We would have benefited from a lot of pig slurry over the years. Even very extensive farms would have used exported pig slurry and K index 4s. And then I have farmers telling me I'm going to go buy 18-6-12. And I'm like, why are you buying the 12? You have more than enough in your K. So save yourself the money there. Spread less of something else. But change is difficult. Change is very hard to try and manage it. But it's
greater awareness of the benefits.
Yeah, like awareness of the benefits and straightforward. Even liming is the simplest one because it's a not an annual really process for a lot of farms, but it's a once off. And again, just matching with what you have.
Great, Thomas. Thanks very much, Pat. A lot of questions coming in here now.
I think a general appreciation of the insights you're given from an awful lot of people who are online this morning. A question here, not simple, but topical, I suppose, given the day that's in it with protests going on around the country. I was wondering if you have any comments or suggestions regarding the upcoming cap and changes that might happen there.
So there's been a few elements that have been muted, the likes of allowing for landscape features as opposed to, or not docking for those. I think that's certainly. That's a welcome change because it opens the door to things. And some of the biggest interventions are the likes of ponds, right? And there's always a joke on Twitter that all the dairy farms are trying to compete with each other every week. And the other week it was who can build the biggest pond, and even we're planning a pond here and stuff like that. Mostly because they're just single biggest change that we can make. So that's a huge open, a kind of a welcoming. I think there's potential in the eco schemes, and I know our again during my time in Macra we would have looked at this. I think there's potential in the eco schemes as long as they're not exclusionary, because ultimately if you come to my farm and tell me that I have to become an unviable farm, but I have to do this stuff for the environment, that's just not going to work for me. I'm going to reject it because I need to make an income. I need to make an income for myself and my parents. So there has to be a bit more awareness that there's a balanced approach. That's the reason sustainability has four pillars. It's because you can't do anything in isolation with that. But again, maximizing the area which is not very productive would be far more beneficial on each and every farm. And ultimately rewarding those farms then that have a higher level of environmental ambition in a progressive way would really change the dial a lot, I think.
A question to change tack a bit. You mentioned that nitrogen doesn't grow grass when conditions aren't suitable. How do you decide when to apply your nitrogen?
Yeah, it's a challenging one. So again, soil temperature is the first and most important one, and then soil saturation level. If I'm walking on a field and it's squinching underneath me, I'm not going to spread nitrogen on that field. And those are just some simple indicators. You can't predict the weather though. Ultimately, I could spread nitrogen today and it looks like a good weather forecast, and then it turns cold and wet. And it happened a couple of times during this year. But even if we can start from that essential point, when soil temperatures are getting up higher, instead of spreading before soil temperatures, I'd say, hold the wish a little bit and wait a little bit longer now and again. And again, it's not necessarily an all or nothing. I have fields here on the top of drumlins, which are much drier than other fields. And I have wetter, colder fields. And so again, it's going back to the nutrient management plan or looking at your farm, not as an individual, but as a whole. And then I'd also say in terms of when you are wanting to spread it, not front loading it in a single application. So not being afraid to go out with a third of a bag of urea equivalent or 20, right? Again, compacting, you don't want to be doing it too often. But certainly I would always tentative steps, let that grass grow, graze it off, and then spread my fertilizer again the second time at a higher rate.
A fairly blunt question. has the country reached saturation point in production levels in meat and milk?
If you were to, if I was to answer that question bluntly, we probably reached it in the 1920s, because we export, we're an export nation. We don't produce solely for ourselves. And I'm very proud of that fact. I mean, my milk goes all over the world, and I make no apologies for that fact. I'm part of a global community, and more importantly, probably more relevantly, I'm part of an EU community. We are a very efficient producer here. That doesn't exempt us from having to get better, but we are a very efficient producer here. It's far better to produce milk off grass in County Cavan necessarily than it is off grain in Germany. And maybe some of the German, if there's anyone from Germany, they might disagree with me on that. But that's a fact. We have a low emissions intensity. Again, that doesn't change the fact, though, that we have to get better and we have to protect our own environment for our long-term sustainability and their ability to do that. But in terms of saturation, I mean, how long we're currently at about 7. And I like getting into the we feed the world type discussion, but in terms of this, we know 2 facts. Our populations are growing globally, and the demand for meat and dairy are growing globally. So is it better for us to improve our structures and try to supply that product from here, or leave it to other countries to do it, and the likes of Brazil and the Mercosurs, which are deforesting huge amounts of the Amazon? Again, this is not a we feed the world kind of a thing, but it's just a fact. Meat can only be consumed once. If it's going to be consumed from Ireland or it's going to be consumed from Brazil, I'd rather it be consumed from Ireland.
Could I just tease that one out a little bit, just around the tipping point, or who decides, or when do we decide? Okay, we're at a point where we have that the environment can't sustain any more cows or any more production or expansion, because this is a question that has been raised over and over throughout this entire series. And I know it's look, some would say, look, it's a very simplistic view, but just be interested to get your views on, where does the line stop?
So the line should be wherever it is minus waste. And so that's ultimately, at the moment, we are wasting a lot of the resources that we're using. We're losing them to water, we're losing them to air. So we're using more resources than we need to produce to feed, right? If we could get that back in line, and then again, it's for biodiversity, again, we are managing things in a way which we don't need to from a productive point of view, but we have a vision in our head of the way things should be. We need to detach ourselves from that. The tipping point is always, I mean, again, we won't drill into it too much, but I mean, you go back to Malthus and overpopulation and Eldridge. Apparently, we should all be starving. I never should have been born, according to Malthus and those, because ultimately, and then we had the likes of the Green Revolution, which brought, Norman Borlaug as a personal hero of mine, partially for his attitude towards farming and the changes that have brought, and listening to farmers. The man that saved 1 billion lives ultimately. But with the Green Revolution came pollution, came all the rest of it. So we need a new green revolution. We need a more sustainable, and I don't dwell too much on that term sustainable, but we need a more low impact changes. So changes like moving away from ammonia based fertilizers and moving towards clovers, and all of these kind of things can reduce it. Ultimately, we are a species that has never failed to live up to a challenge. We've lived through one cataclysmic climate change before in the Ice Age, and we only had sticks and woods, and we were hunting mammoths at the time. Now we have technology and advancements that we can make and implement. The challenge is uptake and how much money is going to be willing to put into it, because farmers can't afford to do this all on their own. They need government support. They need support from the community to do that, not demonization. And if you do it and you do it right, you get far more benefit from that, I think.
Thanks, Thomas.
Just a little bit of confusion in amongst some of the audience between multi-species sward and species-rich sward, which you featured both of. And maybe you might describe, I suppose, the role and the potential advantages of both in terms of environmental outcomes.
Sorry, and I probably mixed up the terminology. I probably should have used high nature value farming there in terms of that. So the species rich or high nature value farming are naturally occurring meadows. So there you have slight own productive type products. So you'll still get plantain in both of them. You might get chicory in both of them, but there you'll find, the daisies, the yellow rattles, the wild clovers, and all of those are growing. And really, The way we manage that is a very low intensity area, maximizing it for species richness and for biodiversity. Then the multi-species grassland is an attempt essentially partially to cut out as much fertilizer as possible, but also to make it more resilient to drought. So there you're talking about your perennial ryegrass, you're talking about your red and white clovers, you're talking about your chicory and plantain, and there are additional ones that other farms also put in. I think there's a 7 seed mix, we used 5 seed mix. Ultimately, those are they're still intensive management. I mean, I'm still grazing them intensively. It's a different form of intensive management. And there is benefits for biodiversity in terms of the white clover will still flower and stuff, but really therefore a nutrient management and a climate change measure less than they are a biodiversity measure. The biodiversity measure is your species rich grasslands, your high nature value farming areas. Yeah.
An interesting question, and it's following on from a topic that Tom Arnold discussed, where the question here is saying there's a big division emerging between farmers, especially dairy farmers, and environmentalists. How can we find, or what do we need to do to find middle ground, or is there middle ground?
There is middle ground between some of both. I often hear saying like there's always middle ground between all of us. I don't think there is middle ground between all of us. I think it depends ultimately. And one of the interesting things that when I studied environmental science is there's 2 competing philosophies. One is wise use philosophy, which basically says, look, human beings exist, human beings need to be fed. And how can we do that in the best possible way and leave as much space for nature as possible? Then there's the competing philosophy that human beings shouldn't be the center of the world. And ultimately, that goes down a very dark path, in my opinion. And needless to say, I very much subscribe to the wise use philosophy on this. But in the wise use philosophy and farmers, there is a big overlap because farmers ultimately do care to some extent about the environment. And often it's simply, the simplest example I often give, on farms around the country, if you dig up the soil, you will find plastic, right? Farmers in the past buried plastic. Why? Because a lot of older farmers didn't realize it would last forever. They just didn't. Everything else broke down. So when plastic was introduced, it was an issue. There's no excuse for burying plastic today. You recycle it. That's what you do. You don't burn it, you recycle it. And ultimately, like there's a place. But yet, when I went over recently to a plastic recycling center, you hear about these wonderful recycling bins. Jesus, there was building height of black plastic where farmers had taken their own time and their own money to recycle a product. So that doesn't tell you something I don't know what does about how farmers care about the environment. Equally, there are a group of farmers that simply do not care. They're a minority, thankfully, but they do not care. And there won't be any kind of overlap there because we are a diverse community and some people will have different priorities to others. And also, it will depend on what your situation is. It's a different matter if I'm not, and Mark, you mentioned about leaving area for things. We're quite landlocked here and we're quite fragmented. I couldn't afford to give a huge amount of area to nature on my grazing platform because I don't have it to give. But my outblocks, different matter, different discussion. I'll still use a bit of the waste ground on my own farm, but yeah, look, that covers a bit of it.
Question here in relation to whether you see an opportunity on your farm in relation to energy production.
Yes, I do. So I'm probably one of the few full-time farmers that you'll come across that drives an electric car. And there was a deliberate reason why I put my charger up on the outside of the dairy, which looks really strange. I get some strange looks and the contractors arrive and there's this car plugged in. Because I plan to put solar panels on the entire roof of the dairy. But the problem is at the moment, and even in the consultation that was recently done, there's not enough incentive at the moment for small scale renewables, and it's a massive issue. We need to reform the whole planning permission area. We need to start feeding it in. We saw even recently, there's warnings now of rolling blackouts because the grid isn't able to adapt it because we haven't adopted solar fast enough, really. And at the moment, the wind is simply not blowing. So we're relying on natural gas. But there are sheds throughout the entire country that could be supplying this renewable. It's more of a challenge. I'm not diminishing that from an air grid's point of view. It's much more challenging when you have a lot of smaller suppliers. But it's definitely something we could do. So the plan here is to invest probably a little bit down the line in a solar panel and install, either we will have a robot, which we won't need to install a battery pack, and we'll be charging the car off that, or we will just be charging the car directly and using it for the robot because the robot will use it all the time.
A question here in relation to buffer zones along your rivers, and what are you doing in that respect?
Yeah, so a mainstream runs through the grazing platform, and then the rest of them are kind of bounded by it. So again, we just follow because most of the ground, thankfully, beside it is fairly level. It's not a severe slope. We do take account of the slopes when we're near the streams, when we're spreading fertilizer. So the big advantage, and I mentioned there about the fact that we went for a second-hand machine. When I'm doing the last strip, I even a little bit beyond the outside, what I'll do is I'll adjust down my spreader on that side. So I might drop it to 50% beyond the buffer zone, so there's not an extra area. And it depends, really. It depends. Like this time of year, I'm not as worried about it. But say when I'm spreading in spring, I'll keep double distance up from it.
Okay. Okay, Mark. Mark, you're muted.
But I have to wrap up the questions there. Thanks, Pat. Thomas, thank you so much for your candid views and wise words. Really appreciate you giving us an insight into your farm and what's happening there. And hopefully at some stage in the not too distant future, we might get to come up and visit you at some stage, because it's you have a great story to tell. Pat, thanks very much for helping with questions. We're a little bit over time this morning, but I think it was worth holding on for those insights from Thomas. So thanks again, Thomas. Next week on the Signpost series, we'll be joined by Una Fitzpatrick from Biodiversity Ireland, who's going to be talking about the pollinator plan in Ireland. So really look forward to speaking to Una about that. And I want to say thank you to our production team, Andy Boland and Yvonne Maher, and Pat Murphy, of course, and all our partners on the series. And we hope you enjoy the fine weather the weekend, and we'll see you next Friday morning. So with that, we'll say goodbye and stay safe. Goodbye.